Okay, in the last lesson we talked about this kind of this tension that's growing internally and from foreign countries, especially from the British. We've had fights with the Native Americans who are being armed by the British. We have ended the Non-Intercourse Act, and we're trading with France again because France has promised to quit taking our ships. So now the only country we're not trading with is with the British, and the British are upset. The British are still seizing our ships and impressing our sailors. They're blockading our ports. And we're still upset that they're supplying the natives with guns. So Madison has asked for a declaration of war from Congress, which he gets. All right? Now, this declaration of war took the British completely by surprise. Really, believe it or not, they didn't think what they had done was so bad that the United States would declare war. They are already in a war with France, and what they don't need is a two-front war, one in Europe and one in the Americas. Now, we are completely unprepared for this because Jefferson had cut the budget. Remember, he'd cut the military budget. We only had 16 warships to face the mightiest navy on earth, the British. We have a very small and unprepared army. We have poorly trained officers and men. So once again, we have to rely on volunteers. Now, Congress kind of tries to sweeten the deal by giving these men cash and land in exchange for service. The money that they gave them comes out to almost a year's salary. That's a lot of money. But still, many of these men desert. So we're unprepared for this war. Now, the British Navy, again, is the most powerful navy on earth, and they are blockading American ports. All right, so we can't get any of our ships out to trade with anybody, with France or any of these countries. So this blockade is effective. However, there are a few notable victories. The most famous was in August of 1812, the U.S. ship Constitution, better known as Old Ironsides. Oh, man. I'm probably going to run out of room. Okay. Defeats the British warship Guerriere off the coast of Newfoundland. I mean, it's called Old Ironside. It's actually made of wood. You can still visit. It's still, believe it or not, a commissioned warship. It sits in Boston Harbor. Go up there and visit it. It is really cool to see. It's made out of this really thick oak, and it was said that the British cannonballs kind of just bounced off of it. In the Constitution, in the Guerriere, they kind of get locked up in this engagement off of Newfoundland. They, jockey for position for quite some time. Finally, Constitution opens up, blows a bunch of holes in its side of the Guerriere, shoots off the Guerriere's mast, and they are forced to surrender. All right? So that's probably the most famous at sea. However, honestly, these small victories scattered here and there really do nothing to impact the war. Now, you remember one of the goals of the Warhawks was to conquer Canada. They thought it was going to be easy pickings. Henry Clay said that he could just take his Kentucky militiamen up there and defeat the Canadians. And Americans thought that the Canadians would actually want to join America. They really did. So American General William Hull moved troops into Canada from Detroit. Now, the British actually have very few poorly trained Canadians. And they're led by this clever British general named Isaac Brock. All right, so what does he do? Kind of reminds you of Vincennes, doesn't it? He parades his men in red coats to make them look like they're many professional soldiers there. He probably has a couple dozen red coats, for all I know. And he makes his men put them on, march around, come back, take them off, put some other guys up there. Kind of try to deceive the Americans that, oh my gosh, these aren't just a bunch of Canadians. This is the professional British Army. The trick worked, believe it or not, and General Hull retreats. So, what's good for the goose, good for the gander. We have done that to the British many times in the American Revolutionary War. So now it's payback, and the British trick us. Now we need to talk about the Battle of Lake Erie. This is pretty amazing if you think about it. Okay, in 1813, the Americans wanted control of Lake Erie. Lake Erie sits just to the north of Ohio, and just to the east of Michigan, goes up to north of Pennsylvania and part of New York. Okay. Now, we want control of the lake because the British are bringing in a lot of supplies into the west, arming the natives. So we want control of the lake. Now, The U.S. commander is a guy named Oliver Hazard Perry. He's got one problem. He has no ships. Hey, Commodore Perry, here's your job. Defeat the British in Lake Erie. Got some bad news, though. You have no ships. So he designed and built his own ships right there on the shores of Lake Erie. Now, this tiny American fleet was able to defeat the British Navy. Now, was it really the British Navy that was out at sea? No. These are kind of, it's hard to explain. Kind of like the merchant marines of today's services. You know, they are armed, they have guns, but they're not like the British ship of the line, men of war. But nonetheless, it's amazing that he can build his own little fleet of ships and defeat the British, who are probably better trained than the American sailors. All right? He has a very famous saying, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." So Oliver Hazard Perry is able to beat the British on Lake Erie. Now, after the loss of Lake Erie, the British and their native allies, remember, led by Tecumseh, was away from Prophetstown at the Battle of Tippecanoe, so he's still around. And he rallies a bunch of the natives to fight on behalf of the British. All right? But after the loss of Lake Erie, their native allies and the British retreat into Canada. Now, General William Henry Harrison, remember, he is the hero at Tippecanoe. He followed them and won a great victory at the Battle of the Thames. Battle of the Thames. Okay? And Tecumseh this time was killed. So Harrison has killed the Prophet at Tippecanoe, and he's killed Tecumseh at the Battle of the Thames. Now, without his leadership, this native confederation really falls apart. He was the catalyst for this confederation. And with his death, that native confederation falls apart. Now let's talk about the South. Now the Creeks. The Creeks live in the southeast United States. You have the Choctaw, the Creek, the Cherokee, the Seminole. They all live in the South. Okay. The Creeks are continuing to fight the white settlers, though. They're very upset about this encroachment onto the land. So we have a new figure we need to talk about. His name is Andrew Jackson of Tennessee. He is going to go on to become the president after some heated rivalries and some contested elections, by the way. Okay, so Andrew Jackson of Tennessee takes command of the American troops fighting the Creeks. So in 1814, Jackson wins this crushing victory over the Creeks at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, which is in Alabama. The Battle of Horseshoe Bend. He crushes them. And the leader of the Creeks actually, is kind of a sad story. And think about what he's saying here. He walks into Jackson's camp and states, "Your people have destroyed our nation." And he surrenders. Now, Jackson is going to go on, in just a little bit, I'm going to tell you about him, and lead other victories. But Jackson has no love for the Native Americans. Not at all. He treats them extremely poorly. We'll get into that in later lectures, but just kind of remember this. He has no love of the Native Americans. So let's talk about the final battles. Well, this doesn't look good for America because in 1814, the British defeat the French. All right? Now, up until this time, they've had to fight the French and the Americans, kind of a two-front war. But the French have been defeated. All right? Now they're able to concentrate just on America, and they send many more troops over to America to fight. So in August of 1814, the British sail into the Chesapeake Bay, and they land about 30 miles from Washington, D.C. The Americans fight the British, but they are scattered. In fact, there's stories about James Madison actually manning a cannon. All right? The British march into the capital of the United States of America, Washington, D.C., and set fire to the nation's capital. They burned the White House down and other buildings. Dolly Madison, James Madison's wife, was able to save a very famous picture of George Washington. But now, guess what? The capital of the United States has been burned down by the British. But here's an amazing thing that happened. You're not going to believe this. That very night, they think it's probably a hurricane. came in on shore and put out the fires. That's right. The British, probably had desired maybe to burn almost the whole thing down, but they don't, because that night heavy rains and wind actually put out most of the fires. So some people see this as kind of divine intervention. But the British have burned and destroyed our capital. The British then head north towards Baltimore, where they attack Fort McHenry. And they bombard Fort McHenry for 12 hours. Now, Francis Scott Key is a lawyer from Baltimore. He's on a British ship trying to win release of a friend of his from the British who have captured him, I should say. And he's on the deck of this British warship watching this bombardment of Fort McHenry all night long. And the next morning when the sun comes up, our flag is still flying over Fort McHenry. And this inspires Francis Scott Key to write by the way, it's a poem, a very, very famous poem, which was later turned into the national anthem. Music was added, and he wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, which becomes our national anthem. So, at Fort McHenry, the British bombarded for 12 hours, but at the end, in the morning, the flag was still there. Okay, let's talk about what happened next, because this is really interesting. Okay, in late 1814, the British decide to attack New Orleans. Now, Andrew Jackson, you remember him from the Battle of Horseshoe Bends, is prepared. He's been there for quite some time. He's built up great defenses in preparation for this battle with the British. On January the 15th, 1815, remember that, the battle takes place. The British start to march up the shore, but it's really sticky, muddy, swampy, and the only thing that they can do is kind of approach Jackson's line straight on. They want to kind of go around it, but they can't because of the swamps and mud, so they're forced to kind of approach it just head on. And the Americans destroy the British. They kill over 2,000 British soldiers, with only 7 Americans killed. This battle is going to thrust Jackson onto the national stage. He is a national hero. But guess what, guys? The battle happened after the war was over. What? That's right. Let me talk about that. Because there's no communications. I mean, very little communications. The only way you can get a message is to get on horseback and write it out there. This battle actually happened after the Treaty of Ghent was signed in Belgium. The British and the Americans have gotten together and in Ghent, Belgium, on December 24th, 1814. Remember, the Battle of New Orleans was fought on January 15th, 1815. All right? And they signed the Treaty of Ghent, ending the war. The British and the U.S. agreed to restore pre-war conditions. Really, nothing is going to be settled. Some people say that, we won the war, but we really didn't. I think that a lot of people think we won the war because of the Battle of New Orleans. It was such an overwhelming victory. But guess what? That happened after the peace treaty was signed. Okay? So nothing is really settled. The British and the U.S. agreed to restore pre-war conditions. Impressment was not even addressed because it kind of just went away once the French and the British quit fighting. There's no reason for the British to take our ships or to take our sailors any longer. So it just kind of fades away. It did settle a dispute along the U.S.-Canadian border, though. All right. One thing I would say, though, and I think an important thing to remember is a peace treaty has to be approved by both the Senate here in the United States and the Parliament back in England. Now, what if the British had absolutely massacred the Americans, captured the city of New Orleans? Well, maybe the British Parliament would have said, I don't think we're going to sign this or ratify it. Or maybe we'll amend it, that we get New Orleans now. So even though the battle, this overwhelming victory by the Americans actually occurs after the battle, after the Treaty of Ghent was signed, it probably helped secure the passing and ratification of that treaty by the British Parliament. All right, so there you have it. We do not get Canada. No. The Canadians aren't interested in joining the United States. Were we justified in this war? I would have to say we probably were. I mean, you can't allow the British to seize your ships, to seize your sailors, to blockade your ports, to arm the natives. So I'd say we're justified. However, I would say that we were probably a little foolish thinking this was going to be some easy victory. We were completely unprepared. No navy, poorly trained army. And we really thought that the Canadians wanted to join us, which they did not. All right? So there you have it. The War of 1812, it's over. Kind of ends in kind of a stalemate in a way. Nothing is really gained. We don't get Canada, we don't get Florida, but we at least kind of stand up to the British. Now, some Americans thought this war was a mistake. In fact, there's a bunch of New England merchants who are very upset about this. They think that their livelihood is being threatened by this war with Britain. Remember, these are former Federalists and Federalists. They had always kind of backed the British. So right in late 1814, they actually have a thing called the Hartford Convention, which they threaten to secede from the Union. That's right, secede from the Union, leave the United States if this war is not ended with the British. These are Federalists. They're unhappy with the Republican Party. Now, the war is going to come to an end. The Treaty of Ghent is going to solve the dispute. But guess what this does? This idea, this talk of secession weakens the Federalist Party even further. All right? Now, the war does do one other thing, though. It does provide kind of a greater sense of nationalism and pride in the America that we would stand up and fight for our rights. So there are, I guess, a couple good things that come out of this war, but not many.